The magic circle is a term that game academics like to throw around about the theoretical space that exists when you play. It allows you to do things and feel in different ways that you might not during everyday life. So, what happens when games allow you to access and act in grief in ways that you might not in everyday life? Our next speaker designed a game that gives people an opportunity to explore grief, and he designed it by dialing into certain spiritual technologies and ancestral knowledge. You might see some connections between this talk and another talk that we aired this year on decolonizing cozy games by Tristan Tarwater. If you haven't checked it out, I'd encourage you to do so. But this talk gives a great example of some of the transformative changes that can happen when we bring our full selves to our game design and to our play. A death doula, Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, game designer, and more, please welcome to the stage, Christian Howard.
Hi, my name is Christian Howard, and I'm speaking to you today from the unceded and currently occupied lands of the Tongva and Chumash people, commonly referred to as Los Angeles. I'm a writer, educator, experienced designer, Tibetan Buddhist meditation teacher, death doula, and game designer. I'm a world builder who bridges what might seem like separate ideas into engaging and immersive experiences. Today, I want to share a little about how and why I've been designing and modifying games for the dying. First, let me set some context about death and dying in the United States. In the US, we have a death literacy problem. We've medicalized dying, isolated grief, and created systems where marginalized communities have long faced substantial barriers to dignified end of life care. The numbers really help tell this story. 77% of Black Americans lack end of life planning. Due to the ongoing health disparities caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, Black Americans now face a 2.9-year life expectancy gap compared to white Americans. And we're heading into what some demographers have nicknamed the silver tsunami, the reality that by 2030, all baby boomers around the world will be 65 or older, which will have unprecedented effects on our understanding of social structures, job tenure, education, end of life care, and so much more. Black, Latine, and Indigenous folks have lower life expectancy and higher mortality rates compared to other racial and ethnic groups, less access to hospice and other palliative care, often face medicalized racism, and our cultural approaches to death, grief, and mourning are often overlooked or dismissed by mainstream healthcare systems. At the same time, many of us, regardless of background, struggle to talk about mortality in meaningful ways. We treat death as a failure, whether medical, physical, or moral, rather than the most natural transition we will all experience. And we have few community-based practices for processing loss together. So, in my desire to create something to meet the challenges I and my doula clients face, my question became, how might play work as a liberatory practice for communities that have been historically oppressed, especially around grief and mortality? Every game or experience I've ever made has been a response to something in the world that felt broken or impossible to live with. Augmented reality games that surface the unconscious colonial mindsets inside even the most progressive thinking people. Interactive horror games that problematize the concept of following on social media by turning it into a kind of digital body horror. Creolized coding platforms that teach Black and Brown students how to code as they learn how to make games, and mixed reality co-op games that cultivate pro-social behaviors as they build a revolution against tyranny. My games have always engaged deeply with culture and politics, and lately, the focus on how Black and Brown folks die differently in America has been pointing toward how we might reclaim some agency in the processing of grief. This comes directly from my work as a death doula, specifically supporting people of the global majority and queer folks seeking end-of-life experiences that honor their inherent dignity, creativity, and beauty. I should say here that this isn't just theoretical for me. In my doula work and in my own experiences with chronic health issues, I've seen how our current physical and mental health systems fail people, especially people who look like me, who love like me, and who exist on the margins like me. I've witnessed families navigate impossible decisions without community support. I've seen how grief gets pathologized when it doesn't fit neat timelines. And I've experienced how isolating it feels to watch loved ones die in care institutions that don't honor and respect their cultures, much less their basic humanity. But I've also witnessed the power of community care, the healing that happens when people have intentional space to grieve authentically, and the strength that emerges when cultural practices and creativity are honored and centered. This got me thinking about how ancestral knowledge has given rise to what we might call spiritual technology, tools and practices our ancestors developed to navigate the big questions of existence, to engage with feelings of awe and wonder, to not only process change and transformation, but to practice them, to embody them. These weren't digital tools, but rather time tested ways of understanding ourselves and our world. And play has always been one of those technologies, a way to process complex emotions and explore what normally feels too overwhelming to face directly. What I'm talking about isn't a modern adaptation of play. For thousands of years, cultures have used games to explore life's most confounding questions. In Hindu traditions, there's a concept called lila, which very roughly translates to divine play. At the risk of making a more complex idea a bit simple, lila asks us, what if life itself is like an infinite cosmic game? Not a game with winners and losers, but a game where the point is just to play, to experience, to learn. An infinite game to explore all aspects of how you experience the world and to gain a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. 5,000 years ago, Hindu scholars created what we might consider now to be a board game for Leela, which was later adapted into the more modern game Snakes and Ladders, or in the US, Chutes and Ladders. But the original wasn't about getting to the finish line. Players moved through different squares representing life experiences, using a die and a personal item like a ring as their game piece. The snakes represented vices and moral challenges, while the ladders represented virtues and spiritual growth. When Milton Bradley brought it to America, they sanitized it, replacing the snakes with chutes to appeal to children, stripping away the deeper moral and spiritual teachings. The original goal was to understand that all these experiences, both the falls and the climbs, are part of one big ongoing game of existence. Tibetan Buddhism has similar ideas about the ways that deeply knowing oneself can lead to greater compassion and an acceptance of impermanence, the understanding that change is constant and that all things in time fade away. The insight here is that when we approach difficult topics through curiosity, openness, discernment, non-judgment, and kindness, core qualities that we often design for in games and that are core to many spiritual philosophies, we can engage with challenges more openly and with less fear or defensiveness. I set out to explore how these technologies of play, those from my own Black and Indigenous cultural heritages, and also from my Tibetan Buddhist spiritual practice, come together. And what emerged was a Nordic style live action role play, or LARP for short, called All My Relations. In the game, players embody the relations of a recently deceased matriarch, lovingly nicknamed Mama, for a gathering at the repast, that communal meal held after funerals. The game's name itself, All My Relations, is a direct nod to a phrase deeply rooted in my cultural heritage, a saying that calls attention to the interdependence and interrelational aspects of family and community. For us, relations are blood relatives, friends, neighbors, and community members, both living and dead, as much as they are the land we live on, the water that provides life, the plants, animals, the seen and unseen. The name is also an invitation to stay in your body and to play with an openness to change. It's also a marker of consent. All My Relations is not an experience for people to role play as Black folk or to try out what it might be like to appropriate the cultural traditions of another. Instead, it's a place to explore the way grief asks us to show up in our vulnerable wholeness and uniqueness. with humility and compassion. The game also pulls heavily from my Tibetan Buddhist lineage, albeit more in the subtleties of the narrative structure, world building, and mechanics, by weaving in pro social practices rooted in the teachings of the four immeasurables. These immeasurables, also known as the Brahma Viharas, are four virtuous states of mind and qualities of being with ourselves and others, often cultivated in Buddhist practice. The immeasurables are loving kindness, or the wish for the happiness and well being of all beings, including ourselves; compassion, or the aspiration for others to be free from suffering and a desire to remove their pain if possible; empathetic joy, or experiencing happiness at the joy and flourishing of others; and equanimity, a quality of stability and acceptance in the presence of others' desires and actions. Players take on the character of one of Mama's relations as they navigate interpersonal dynamics, share long held secrets, repair old wounds, and collectively explore grief in all its messy complexity. Each playthrough gives rise to uniquely emergent co created narratives driven by the players and sustained by the relationships they choose to deepen throughout the game's runtime. Some players chose to be a grieving child of the deceased, still in shock; others, estranged cousins meeting for the first time in years, or grandchildren struggling with complicated feelings about their mother's death. Some chose to be a neighbor, a long forgotten ex lover, or even a previous coworker who only knew Mama from a distance. All were welcome in Mama's house. When players arrived, the space was designed to feel like stepping into an actual home. There's food made from my own family's morning traditions, images of the matriarch, memorial items, even music that Mama would have played for herself while moving around the house on a warm Sunday afternoon. Because grief has been sanitized for so many of us, the game creates space for the full spectrum of human emotions included in grief. Laughter mixed with tears, relief alongside sadness, jealousy mixed with fear, anything and everything that might arise. What makes this game work is that players aren't performing grief, they're exploring it. And they're not trauma dumping their real life losses on one another either. Instead, they're learning and practicing the real behaviors of collective grieving and mutual care in order to be present with the difficult emotions, both their own and those of the other players. LARP designers often create space for players to have an alibi, a core mechanic or aspect of an in game identity that enables players to act in ways the player might not normally act outside of the game space. A creative mask offering players permission to be emotionally and intellectually vulnerable in ways that feel more accessible. When we play, we're practicing different ways of being, different responses to loss, different relationships to our own mortality. Part of what draws me to play as a medium is how it reframes failure. In most of life, we're taught to avoid failure, to see it as something shameful or wasteful. Both in play, failure becomes rich learning, even growth. Play allows us the space to explore complicated ideas or situations with excitement and creativity rather than fear. And in LARP, failure isn't really an end. In fact, endings often push play further. It's not uncommon in the setup or onboarding of a LARP to learn how the narrative ends before the game even kicks off. Sometimes because this helps players to manage anxiety, other times because the point of the game is not to discover what happens like in a linear narrative, but rather to deeply explore and connect with the themes and emotions developed through play with an inevitable, maybe even disastrous outcome. When we play, we can practice different responses to loss, different ways of being vulnerable, different relationships to our own mortality. The stakes feel lower, so we can take emotional risks we might not otherwise take. All My Relations works through carefully designed mechanics that honor how grief moves in Black ritualized gatherings. Upon arriving, players are greeted by a friendly faced player portraying everyone's favorite cousin. They're reassured that while the food hasn't yet arrived at the house for the repast to start, there's something important Mama would have wanted everyone to do before they celebrate her rich and inspiring life: talk to one another and let all those old, unsettled tensions go. Players have access to memory cards throughout the game, which help to prompt storytelling moments, things like, tell us about a time mama made you laugh, or share a secret she taught you that you still carry. And because real gatherings after funerals aren't all warmth and comfort, there are mechanics for navigating complicated grief too. Old dramas that resurface, generational trauma, or simply the stress of travel, age, and uncertainty. When I ran this game in Brooklyn last year, something beautiful and unexpected happened. Players didn't just role play grief, they found interesting, safe ways to connect their relationship to loss to their characters. In LARP, there is a game mechanic we often communicate in onboardings to help players navigate ways to relate to one another. I know this as playing to lift. Lifting here means that players intentionally play to acknowledge and validate the stories and experiences other players are bringing to the game. For instance, during a celebratory toast when players were celebrating Mama's virtuous qualities, one player suddenly began to cry. She shared with everyone her fraught relationship with Mama, one of impossible expectations, tense emotions, and deep regret. Instead of ignoring this player or discounting her experiences, the other players surrounded her, offered her physical reassurance, apologies, and appeals for how they might repair their character's relationship with hers now that they had more insight into what they were all holding. One player told me afterward that embodying a character grieving their grandmother helped them access emotions they'd been carrying around about their own grandmother's death years earlier. And doing this with strangers somehow made them want to talk more openly about grief. Another said the experience helped them understand how their family's way of grieving, which includes a lot of humor and storytelling, was a form of healing, not avoidance, something that filled her body with a sense of safety long after the game was over. The game created a genuine intimacy between players. And by the end, players were holding each other's hands, sharing real stories alongside fictional ones, and creating the kind of community support that we often feel lacking when navigating actual loss. My hope is that the game invites players into what Buddhist scholar and activist Joanna Macy describes as a tantric flip, that as players allow themselves to experience their character's pain and the pain of others, they flip into a realization of interconnectedness. This flip alters their perspective and brings them closer to a more compassionate way of being and perceiving. Realizing a shared kinship with all life, they feel excited to act to relieve the suffering of others, and so go forth in compassionate action to lift each other up. What have I learned as a game designer making games for the dying and those grieving? Well, first, design with cultural specificity, not generic universality. All My Relations centers Black and Indigenous mourning traditions because that specificity is what gives it power. When we try to make something for everyone, we often make it meaningful to no one. Second, community isn't optional. I can't design authentic cultural experiences in isolation. The game works because it emerged from real conversations with death doulas, elders, and community members who've lived these experiences. Grief, like shame, is helped when we share it with others. Third, safety tools must be culturally informed. Standard game safety mechanics might not work for communities with different relationships to vulnerability, authority, and trust. And fourth, embrace the messiness of human emotion. Honor the full spectrum of grief. Too often, we treat joy and sorrow as opposites, but real mourning includes laughter, relief, frustration, celebration, all of it. Here's what I really want you to take away. Grief is messy business. It's unpredictable, and there's no solution. The process of grief is a continual process of world building, constantly finding new ways to experience life, the good and the bad, tinged by the lingering impact of loss. But games can be pathways for individuals and communities to reclaim agency around mortality and meaning making. In a world that tries to sanitize death, flatten grief, and isolate us in our pain, intentional play can bring us back to community centered approaches to loss and ancestral healing tools that might support our unique cultural needs. I don't see the work I'm doing as separate from the work of liberation that Black and Brown communities have been doing for centuries. I see it as a complement. When we create spaces where people can practice being fully human, where grief and joy can coexist, where our cultural knowledge gets honored and transmitted, we're doing revolutionary work. So I want to ask all of you, what ancestral technologies exist in your own communities? What spiritual traditions that you are a part of offer practices around healing, storytelling, world building, or meaning making that could be respectfully honored and evolved through game design? How might we create more games that don't just entertain, but that help people practice being human in a world that often demands we suppress the complexity of our humanity? The tools are already there in our cultures, our traditions, our ways of being together. Our job as designers is to create containers where that wisdom can emerge and be shared. Thank you for your time and attention. I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, or ideas about how play might serve your own communities. You can find more about my work at christianmhoward.com and connect with me on Instagram at playfulmindchristian. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that talk, Christian. Play is such a powerful part of who we are and how we live in the world. And yet, to utilize that play as an opportunity to explore grief, I think instinctively you would say that to somebody and they might feel it as disrespectful, but play gives us an opportunity to enter into spaces that sometimes feel more real than our day-to-day lives. So to be able to channel those elements of ancestral knowledge, spiritual technology, to connect not just to grief, but to others along the way. It's the power of games and game design. I hope that you watching this talk were able to gain some knowledge. Maybe think of some ways you can tie yourselves and tie each other together through the power of play. If you'd like to connect with Christian, you can find him on Instagram at Playful Mind Christian.